Hello, and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I am your host, Joe Devine, and today I'm joined by Alex Stewart.
Hello.
Hello, and welcome.
Thank you.
And by Seb Stafford-Bloor.
Hello, Joe.
Hello, and welcome.
Thank you very much.
How are you?
I'm very well.
Good. We're talking about Aston Villa today, newly promoted Aston Villa, back to the big time, back to the Premier League. Seb, you wanted to start with the playoff final, which I suppose makes the most sense as an opening for us.
Yeah, I think so. Villa were rightly considered favourites going into that game. And for the vast majority of it, they played extremely well. I mean, it wasn't as far as playoffs go, it wasn't a particularly exhilarating game of football to watch, but they played with a decent amount of authority. They took the lead, they doubled it. They never really looked in danger. I mean, Derby had a little bit of a flourish towards the end of the game. I think actually the tail of that match is probably going to be what Frank Lampard got wrong in hindsight.
Which is what, do you think?
There was so little urgency. Like it seemed, even after they went behind, so Villa took the lead, El Ghazi's header getting the lead just before half-time. And then their goalkeeper made a real hash of a sort of it was like a charge down which floated into a 6-yard box, and he came out, didn't take the ball above his head, and got beaten to it by John McGinn, 2-0. And it was only with about sort of 10 minutes to go that Derby realised, well, actually our entire season comes down to it. I thought the attacking balance was wrong. I can't pronounce his name. It's a left winger called, I think it's Joseph Sloon or something. Anyway, he came on and his end product wasn't particularly good, but he gave them a kind of pace down the left side, which caused Villa a few problems. But some of that may have been the occasion. Like halfway through the second half, Villa lost Tyrone Mings, who I know John McGinn was awarded man of the match, but I thought Mings was absolutely outstanding in that game. It was terrific at centre half. And when he came off, it changed things. So whether that's a false economy, I don't know. Lampard may very well have an excellent managerial future, but I thought that sort of Dean Smith showed up a few of his kind of flaws or naiveties. I think is the way I look at it. I think also like after a playoff finals won, obviously for a week or two you focus on, particularly with a club with Villa's tortured past and the way in which they left the Premier League the first time, which was, yes, they eventually got relegated, but it was also kind of slow death. Like through the Paul Lambert years when it was very counter-attacking, very defensive, very backs against the wall, and very sort of 17th is our kind of limit. It was a very depressing end for a club of that size.
There was a decay, wasn't there?
It felt like it, and obviously in hindsight we know there was the Randy Lerner years. I think I remember most of all for the statements he used to issue, which are kind of voyages into his psyche. If anyone hasn't read those, go and look those up. They're timeless pieces of work. But I also, the revelations that came out afterwards about sort of just how rotten and how dysfunctional the footballing structure was. Alex and I were talking before we started recording about the stories of sort of their scouting department and how there was a guy, one of their scouts, I think he was in some territory, decided halfway through his contract to go on a gap year or go back to university. And so Villa had all these kind of inefficiencies which were revealed. And it was just not how a football club of that standing should be run. So I think for now, terrific, welcome back. Villa have got some serious wealth behind them as well. So it's not a situation where they're limping into the Premier League with the expectation of, right, well, we'll do nothing, we'll collect the television revenue, and then if we stay up, terrific. I think this is kind of intended as very much as the second era, second coming. So it's an interesting time, but one of the conclusions you can't get away from the playoff final was just how many of those players that they relied upon in the game who are not actually Aston Villa or not actually contracted to Aston Villa. They're either loanees, they were either there to serve a very specific championship level purpose. And if you take those out, if you factor those out of this team, you realize just how much work there is to do over the summer, and that's a little bit daunting.
Yeah, I mean, we were going to talk about ownership. Maybe it makes sense for us to just talk about the squad now, because I think you're right. I mean, I hadn't watched very much Villa at all this season, but having a cursory glance over the squad list this morning before we recorded the podcast, I noticed two things. One was that Villa have on the books quite a lot of players who have been in and around the Premier League for a long time, which coincidentally also means that they are old. And many players who are either out of contract at the end of this season have already left, or you would expect to leave. and perhaps most concerningly, a couple of loan players who've been central to the first 11 this year in Tyrone Mings and Tammy Abraham, neither of whom are concrete signings. I think Tyrone Mings sounds like it looks more likely than Tammy Abraham does. But we've talked about what promoted teams should do before. In fact, we spoke about this when we talked about Sheffield United a couple of weeks back, and we had a conversation about what the aims should be for teams being promoted from the Championship up to the Premier League. Aston Villa look like they're almost being forced into a sort of Fulham-type situation from last summer. They're going to have to bring in a lot of new players and upset presumably, whatever squad balance existed at the end of this campaign.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so interestingly, Christian Perslow, the chief executive / managing director, he spoke a few days ago. He was interviewed about exactly this because obviously, whereas Sheffield United can have a sort of cheerful approach next season, and Norwich have a fairly unique scouting system, which we imagine they will continue with. Obviously, for Villa, with the progress that they want to make, there is that Fulham parallel, unfortunately. Perslow is someone who probably likes to be on Sky Sports News a little bit too much and has that kind of, he speaks in sort of perpetual footballer, football executive language where it's a little bit grating, but he's a smart guy. And he said, look, we need to, I think the phrase he used was, we need to apply a cold towel, first of all, which he was referring to, we need to get over the euphoria of Wembley, which is very sensible, and evaluate a proper way forward, like a sustainable way forward. They're not going to, I don't think anyone's going to make the same mistake Fulham did just because of the, the recency bias associated with it. It is seen as the fast lane to catastrophe. So they are not going to go and spend 25, 30 million pounds on players. They're not going to bring in a kind of a Jean-Michel Seri figure who's there really to kind of as to use Villa as a stepping stone to his own future. I expect them to move cautiously. They do need to bring in a lot of people. There is going to be volume, but I don't expect there to be much financial risk associated with that volume, particularly given the legacy of the Randy Lerner years. Lerner, I think it would be fair to say, was someone that entered British football without a proper circumspect appreciation for how costly it was going to become to be competitive. He dipped his toe in the water and then tried to sort of hastily retreat from it, much to Martin O'Neill's chagrin, obviously. So I think this time, even though there is far more wealth than previously, and these owners they haven't been very prominent. They haven't been very vocal. They haven't been a kind of we're going to come in and we're going to do this. They haven't set lofty objectives. The one red line seems to be Jack Grealish. Obviously, once the takeover was completed last summer, came always very, very quickly that Grealish was going nowhere, which suits him. He's an Aston Villa fan. And again, Perslow stressed just a couple of days ago he has no interest in discussing Jack Grealish's sale.
Mm-hmm. It might have been hard to keep him this season had they not been promoted. I mean, by the sounds of it, they would have had to sell him just to balance the books.
So right? Grealish, I went to Villa Park very early last season when Steve Bruce was still managing. And I actually saw the tool draw with Brentford, where Dean Smith was managing Brentford. Grealish, going to Villa Park at the moment and watching Grealish play there in front of his own fans is a very unique experience. It's like watching the Queen walk through Windsor. Like, he is adored there. It's probably, I mean, I stand to be corrected. I'm happy to be so, but I say it's probably the closest fan-player relationship that exists in the country. Well, maybe with the possible exception of someone like Harry Kane and Spurs, but it's very much the same dynamic. It is a local boy, a player that his ambition as a child seemingly never really extended beyond, I want to be playing for Villa. Yeah. It's a lovely thing. I mean, I watched him pick up the playoff trophy, and he was holding it in front of the Villa fans at Wembley. It's one of those things that you don't get to see very much anymore, because that situation where you have the young guy who's good enough to come through is rare enough. When you have a young guy that's good enough and actually quite a special player and an expressive player playing for his boyhood club, it's a very unique situation. So it's going to be busy, but I don't think Villa will be foolish. I mean, there's too many people that know the game well enough. Like Perslow whether you like him or not, Pezzo has worked for Chelsea, he's worked for Liverpool. He understands the game.
Mm-hmm.
They are now supported by a proper footballing structure with an actual director of football, which makes sense. A manager in Dean Smith who has been used to not making big splurges in the transfer market, but making astute signings with the assistance previously of Brentford's scouting systems and networks and analytics tools.
So he's used to the structure.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to see them, right, let's go and find this 35 million player from Ligue 1 or the Eredivisie or Serie A who...
Unless it's Jack Butland.
Well, I wouldn't say that falls into the same equation. I think if you were to sign Jack Butland, maybe a little harsh on Jed Steer, the goalkeeper, but Butland is an England international, is hugely underutilised at Stoke or overutilised depending on which way you want to look at it. But he clearly belongs in the Premier League. He's a Premier League caliber goalkeeper who has played there before and who has experienced that league. So if you were to sign him for 15, 20 million, I wouldn't class that as a risk. I'd say that's just a sensible but bold move.
Okay, well, Alex, let's take it to, I suppose, what would seem to me to be the most crucial aspect of the summer upcoming. Hypothetically, Aston Villa don't get to sign Tammy Abraham on a permanent deal. Presumably that's quite bad, given how many goals he scored for them this season. And I think beyond that, I'm blanking on the name of their second striker who scored 9 goals.
Jonathan Kodja.
But presumably they will need a striker if it isn't Tammy Abraham.
Yeah, and it's not just the fact that Abraham contributed 26 goals and no other Villa player got into double figures. It's also the way that they play was very geared towards either creating space out wide, overlaps and then crossing the ball in for Abraham, or Abraham's movement was crucial in terms of generating space for the midfielders pushing forwards, which is how they scored most of their goals. So they, generally speaking, in attack, they would build from the centre-backs out to the full-backs would push up, and then ahead of that you had a fairly kind of oscillating line of the wingers and the midfielders pushing up and Abraham dropping back. The aim was always to get the ball into wide spaces, and when Seb was talking about the playoff game, one of the things that Villa were able to do that maybe Derby weren't able to do was adapt. Villa have a basic plan of how they want to play, and then they can tweak elements of it in terms of how much they press, for example, where they set their defensive line, and how much they encourage the opposition to come onto them to then play into the wide spaces behind the opposition fullbacks. That's the main thing that Derby didn't adapt to. Having a striker like Abraham, who is very mobile, he's very quick, he's able to either get in on the end of crosses or to kind of pull defenders around to allow players like Grealish, McGinn and even Hourihane to push up and score from the edge of the box. That's really hard to replicate.
That costs a lot of money if you can.
Well, yeah, and that's why, I mean, I think Abraham's an excellent player, and we've talked about him before on this podcast in terms of being the sort of player that you would hope if he doesn't go back to Chelsea and start playing games for them, somebody needs to buy him and play him regularly, because he's shown... Yeah, I mean, yes, there's a lot to like about his game from a technical perspective, certainly from a physical perspective, but there are a couple of goals that he scored. There was one against Bolton Wanderers, for example, where he heads the ball basically at like desk height, where there's feet in there. And this is a guy who, and I'm not the last person to talk about passion and heart and wanting it, but he is a hugely committed player. And to see a player on loan playing to that level is quite unusual, because I personally always worry about loan players being quite as committed to the cause as other players for obvious reasons, but this is somebody who really was. So I think replicating that, unless, if I were Villa, I'd almost be tempted to look at my transfer budget and just say, I will chuck literally as much of this at securing Tammy Abraham's signature as I can possibly afford.
How much is Tammy Abraham going to cost?
Well, I don't know. I mean,
the problem presumably
it's
is
not
Chelsea's...
It's not going to happen because of Chelsea's situation. So, in that instance, you're then looking at it and going, well, how is it possible to replicate that? And for example, Dean Smith's system has by and large been a sort of 4-1-4-1, occasionally a 4-3-3, although that's basically the same thing. Occasionally he's played a 4-4-1-1 with Grealish tucked in behind a striker. So there's not necessarily a great deal of room to adapt what he's going to do. And obviously we're looking at a squad that does need a significant amount of rebuilding for the reasons that have been articulated already. If we're talking about not doing a Fulham, for example, actually where they really need to spend their money is at the back, because,
they've got no defenders.
They've
all left.
They were, and again, this is one of my issues with loan signings, is that you become reliant on players, and Tizanbe and Mings had excellent seasons, but they're not going to be there. You're developing a player for somebody else's benefit. And particularly if you use those two players and then the fullbacks, El Mohammadi, Hutton and Taylor, are all in their early 30s.
They add up to over 100.
Hutton's gone already. So your defence is a really awful mishmash of super old and young and talented, but not going to be here next season.
Incidentally, speaking of their defence and loan signings, Richie Delat. Do you know the story of Richie Delat this season?
He was at Melbourne City,
where they played him as a striker, and he scored 6 goals.
No,
which I think would have placed him probably on third or fourth on Villa's top
for the
scorer.
A-League, isn't it?
That's apparently he used to play as a striker when he was younger.
Right.
But I just really like the idea that mid-season, Richie, up you
Have
go,
a
mate.
go.
Have a go.
Why not?
6 goals.
Yeah.
Lovely. Some lovely skill as well, apparently.
Well, yeah, you can see I can see Virgil van Dijk playing as a striker.
Ross
for example.
McCormack is in the A-League in Australia, isn't he?
He's
Another
back
form of
now.
Villa.
Another form of Villa.
Ross McCormack, I believe, is a player that Aston Villa will not be able to get off their books because he costs too much money. Let's talk about defence, though, because this is a scary area, I think. Forgetting about Tammy Abraham, this is a scary area for Villa. As we can see from, certainly in the playoff game, and more recently their most used centre-back pairing was Tuanzebe and Mings, neither of whom are official Villa players. That's sort of frightening, particularly if you consider that Neil Taylor, presumably they're going to buy another left-back because they only have one at the club, and El Mohammadi are both quite old, and maybe, if not moved into rotation, then certainly they'll be bringing in players to assist in those areas.
El Mohammadi will stay as right back cover. I mean, he's a passable, but you're right.
That's a whole new back line.
I think one of the first things to happen, irrespective of the Ming situation, I'm pretty sure Gary Cahill will reappear at Villa Park at some point. Yeah, his relationship with John Terry, but also obviously he started his career there before he moved on to Bolton.
Is he not quite expensive though in terms of wages?
Not really, because Chelsea will let him go on the cheap wages. But then I think you're relying on a player's sense of perspective and goodwill, and thinking you're not really in England centre half anymore. You don't really belong at a club like Chelsea, And if the price of signing someone like that is sort of some semblance of security, a player that's been around the Premier League environment for a very long time, you couldn't really do any better.
He'd be a good signing for them.
So.
And there was a recent interview that he did. I can't remember who with, but there is clearly a deep degree of frustration about the last year at Chelsea. He's very unhappy with how he's been treated.
Can you tell me about Tyrone Mings, though? Because it sounds of the two, he is the more likely to be around next season. Would Gary Cahill, as a hypothetical complement, would those players complement each other? I don't really know anything about Tyrone Mings.
Well, I think if you're looking at trying to build a defence, particularly for a newly promoted side, then the most important quality, I would say, is leadership and experience. They're two qualities, but the mental aspect of the game. And I think someone like Cahill, who has played, going back over Cahill's record as a player, like he was very good, but he's won a lot. He's very experienced.
He's also played a lot of different types of centre half over his time at Chelsea, which is interesting.
And also, I think being asked to play himself as I think he's probably a bit more elegant on the ball than people would necessarily give him credit for.
He's a good footballer, Gary Cahill.
Right.
People remember his earlier years, like as a centre half. First of all, he scored goals that you wouldn't necessarily associate with the position. That scissor kick at Villa Park, but also he scored a brilliant 20-yarder at White Hart Lane a couple of years ago, 10 years ago actually now. He can play, and that's very, very important at Premier League level. That's very much on trend. I can't believe I just said that out loud. Sorry about that.
On trend.
Cut that out.
So I think
cut that out.
I think it would be good. Mings, I'm not going to profess to know a huge amount about Villa's defence as individuals. I look more at the way they defend. So They fall back quite often into quite a narrow defensive line. They're less concerned about conceding the position out in the wide areas because they're confident in defending the centre of the penalty area. Hurahan will drop quite far back. Whelan as well, who often played in that defensive midfield position. So from a defensive system point of view, they're not doing anything especially clever or especially exciting. And so having someone like Cahill to come in to assist with the organisation, maybe to bring on a couple of young players. They've got a lad called Courtney Hauser, who they signed from Wolverhampton Wanderers, who certainly seemed like quite a good prospect, either as a left-sided centre-back or even a left-back a while ago. So, yeah, maybe to come in and add that not coaching, but kind of developmental assistance as well. He makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Is this an opportunity in some ways if you have to retool the entire defence? Not maybe, okay, we'll give El Mohammadi a pass.
It's not an opportunity you want.
It's not an opportunity you want, but in some ways, is it not an opportunity? If, for example, let's say that Dean Smith has inherited this team midway through a season, he might have some ideas about how he'd ideally like to do things, yet he's faced with the challenge of doing things with the players he has at his disposal. Is this in some ways, could it be considered an opportunity to do something slightly more in line with whatever we might imagine Dean Smith's end game?
When it comes to a defence, probably not. I think my preference would always be to sort of defer to defensive chemistry. That feels more important than an individual quality. Especially in a first Premier League season.
So that's very bad then?
Well, it is. I mean, it depends on sort of, look, well, the asterisk here is it is unusual in this situation to be theoretically capable of attracting a Gary Cahill type player, a European Cup winner. So when Bournemouth came up, like I always remember that first season with Bournemouth because their defence, their back four was it was really just four blokes. Like it was four guys and it worked. Bournemouth to this day is still very porous at the back. It's the problem that Eddie Howe can't cure even after signing Nathan Ake. But it was enough. It was enough. The team kept functioning. So if you replace your back four, or back three, back five, or whatever, you got two problems. First of all, kind of the uncertainty that exists within the cracks that develop within your defense without the ball. With the ball, it's a problem too because your defense is your portal into midfield. So you're building a whole new set of combinations without the ball, but you're also reworking all of your exit strategies around these new players too. And so that level of difference is very prohibitive to first of all having a good start in the Premier League, which I've always felt is very, very important. Get into it. If you're bringing a lot of players up for upper division, and a lot of those haven't played or played a lot at that level, they need to feel at home really quickly. Because otherwise, you get to September, October, you're not winning. All of a sudden, it gets pretty difficult. So I don't see much opportunity in it. You can get creative at the other end of the field if you like. That's slightly more forgiving to build an attacking combination. But no, it's the danger area for me.
Okay, but 7 players are leaving. Right, we've got Mark. All have already left. This number will go up as the summer goes on. But Mark Bunn, Tommy Elphick, Alan Hutton, Nico Richards, Miller Jedinak, Glenn Whelan. This is what I was saying earlier about it being a kind of who's who of lower half Premier League players, and also Adoma as well. So, given that number is going to go up, how is it possible for anyone to feel at home? Because what is home? This is what I don't mean to exaggerate the point, but it is quite severe, isn't it? It's not.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Not,
but this is
a
where
huge number of the changing room won't look anything like it did last year.
No,
anything at all.
I don't sort of. This is where your coaching staff earns its money. There are going to be problems, whatever happens once the new season begins, because it's going to be difficult. But these are the advantages of potentially bringing in a Gary Cahill, but also having someone like John Terry on your coaching staff. Dean Smith is has shown himself to be very, very capable, an overperformer habitually. So there's no real way around it. It's about now smart recruiting in a way which complements your coaching staff, recruiting in a way which complements who's already there, who's in your midfield, and what your sort of your stated pattern of play. What is your broader approach going to be in the Premier League? Are you going to be what you were before, which is just back to the walls, go long to a Benteke figure and hope for the best? Because I'm not trying to be reductive, but that's kind of what it became under Paul Lambert at its worst. Or are you going to be a footballing side again? And so there's opportunity in that, but there are these sort of looming, flashing negatives around that.
And I think in that regard, that probably the system and the style that Dean Smith has instituted is the biggest positive for Villa, because I think it's something that they can probably replicate relatively easily and with a reasonable degree of success. They do build from the back to a degree, but it's then comes quite direct quite quickly.
Who are they similar to? Is that like a good way of doing it? Because I often think if we can think of a team that play in a way similarly to Aston Villa, it might help people understand, see that in their head.
Yeah, that's a good question.
And you know what's strange about this is there aren't many sides in their position who have that level of reliance on one player.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say they start and end with Grealish, but there's a lot of deference to him. Like any opportunity he gets the ball, and rightly so, because he's a supremely gifted footballer. But it's quite unique at Championship level to have that calibre of.
It was James Maddison in Norwich City.
But I don't see the parallel. Maddison was obviously gifted. He obviously
the ball went through him every time they.
Yeah, but it doesn't go through Grealish every time when Villa attack. What's interesting is that the one approach that they use seems to be really quite systematic, which is centre back to fullback up the line to winger. Fullback also then pushes up in support, and the cross comes in either to Abraham or pulled back to a midfielder rushing forwards. Or it's give it to Grealish. And Grealish has an ability to carry the ball, to work space and have those little moments that create sort of chaos in the way the opposition are defending. But they're two really different sort of means of progressing the ball. One is extremely sort of systematic, if you will. And that, I think, in terms of having quite a direct approach, defending in the way that they defend, which is not, they do press, but they tend to press relatively low sort of midfield area rather than particularly high or particularly aggressively. I think that sort of works, and they do have a midfield that can create occasional kind of moments of brilliance that will upset teams. The problem is, as Seb said, you can pick a system up and transplant it up a division, and I think in that sense it will work, but it's creating the connections between players. And my personal opinion is there's too much to do.
You know it'd be interesting. So, pretty telling moment in their season. I remember watching the first leg of the playoff semi-final when Conor Hourihane equalised. So, Grealish gets the ball sort of right side of the box, and the amount of West Brom players that were drawn to him, it must have been about 5 or 6 that they just flocked towards him like sort of bees around honey. It was incredible to watch. And then Hourihane, he's got one of the best left foots in the division. He's just left completely alone, 22, 23 yards out from goal, in the position that had he been alone on the pitch, he'd have chosen for himself. And it'd be interesting to find out whether at a higher level, Grealish has played in the Premier League before, but not as the player he is now. Be interesting to see how much displacement he now causes, and how much respect he's afforded by opposition defences, and whether him having the ball in those positions, he'll still be able to go past players, but whether he'll create these opportunities, by kind of by proxy. Very interesting.
It's quite interesting as well. So Grealish started as a left-hand side forward when he burst through, and there's a sort of echo to me almost, and I don't think Grealish is as good as Julian Brandt, but the same idea of taking a player who's very tricky, good dribbler, good carrier of the ball, moving him in field and making him the creative fulcrum of that team. I think the other thing that's interesting about the Hourihane goal, apart from his terrible chest slide that he did once he was celebrating.
Do it on the dry grass, guys.
Yeah, he kind of
it looks
like
painful.
Bumped, and it was slightly to one side.
It's a November to March celebration.
Very, very awkward celebration. But it was the fact that Grealish, I don't want to say that Grealish was loath to give him the ball, but Hourihane was occupying that space with his hand up for quite a long time before he actually got the pass. And if you watch that goal, I think there's an initial move where Hourihane's in basically the same position, to take the same shot, and it's only the second time that the ball gets played back to him. So there is a danger, I think, if you've got a player like Grealish, who is extraordinarily talented and clearly is the best footballer in that squad by some distance, Abraham aside, that you can become a kind of, well, the rest of us just defend and we'll give it to him and hope something happens. And if Grealish buys into that and is therefore loath to release the ball and starts playing a little selfishly, that could be a major issue for them.
Do you think also, though, contrary to that the being in the Premier League at the current age that he is now, we hear a lot about how he's matured as a player and indeed a person as well. Do you think that it's possible that he will learn quickly that he doesn't have the time and space that he had in the Championship, and he'll give up the ball more quickly than he might have done in some of those instances you remember?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. But you don't know, do you? Because character is one of those things that's very difficult to. He's not the sort of player who's necessarily attracted criticism of his personality in the same way as some others. But there was always a brashness there. There was always I'm going to be the one who does all of this. Now, when you're a very talented young man and the type of player that he is at the age that he burst through, that is forgivable. At the age that you then move up, I mean, he's still only 23, but there is a huge amount of responsibility on his shoulders. And I would like to think that he would go the way that sort of Seb has suggested and take on that responsibility as a very positive thing. And in that regard, again, and come back to the same thing, having a player like Gary Cahill around who can assume some of that responsibility and assume some of the leadership from it, because otherwise I think, and it's always very difficult, and this is entirely speculative, but if you're a player who carries the aspirations of a team on your shoulders, that must be extraordinarily difficult. I mean, imagine being a Matt Letizia at Southampton, where you're clearly by far the best player that club's got at that moment in time, and you're the one who's expected to do everything. And Grealish is suddenly, this is return to the promised land and back in the Premier League where Aston Villa belong, and they do belong there. And he's the guy who's got to make it all happen. That could go quite badly wrong.
I'd also, there's a caveat in here as well. If Villa don't do well, whatever happens in the next season, Jack Grealish will not be going back to the Championship. And so you have this added dimension where your finest player, your prized asset, the emotional centre point of your side. If Villa are struggling within a few months, and if there is the suggestion of relegation, you can bet anything you like, the rumours will start, and with good reason. So you wonder how that as a variable is going to affect their dynamic as a side. It's difficult.
We've got Gary Cahill as a sort of reasonable dream in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Give me a
reasonable
dream. It's the sort of dream that you wake up from and you go, yes, that was reasonable.
That was okay. Yeah.
I think in left back there needs to be recruitment. And also, I'm going to come back to Tammy Abraham. We talked about that. We hinted at the possible difficulties there, but let's address it fully, because if he does not come back and become a permanent player, which it seems like he probably won't, what on earth are they going to do?
I don't know is the honest answer.
What's more important? Let's say, for example, that they'll have a budget already. We know that they've got a lot of work to do in defence, but if they don't have anyone who scores any goals, what's more important coming up into the Premier League? Where are you supposed to spend your money?
Goals, because
goals.
Yeah, if you look at the weaknesses of, if you look at Huddersfield, for instance, Huddersfield were not the bad team they were presented as. I mean, they had very, very obvious flaws. But their biggest issue through both seasons, they just couldn't score goals. They didn't have forwards on the pitch that were anything like Premier League standard. One thing with Abraham, I watched a lot of Abraham at Swansea. And the summer before, I'd been in Poland with him and the under-21s, and I'd spent some time with him and was thoroughly impressed by what he was, what he'd been at Bristol City, and the type of person he was. So I thought, this is a guy that's going to adapt really well to the Premier League. And it didn't really happen. He has the ability to be a Premier League forward. I don't think we should be presenting him as someone that is going to get 20 goals if he were to hypothetically stay at Villa. I don't think. I mean, he's someone that needs to grow into Premier League life.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. But
who's our Gary Cahill?
Or Gary Cahill of the forward line.
Yes.
Oh.
And it's not Richie Delatte, I don't think. Although it clearly could have been.
I mean, it's about who's available. I mean, I want to look at Premier League players who have a record for scoring goals, who would be...
Glenn Murray.
IOC Perez.
Okay.
You know, I mean, someone like that. Or if for instance, this hinges on what happens at Newcastle, takeover or otherwise, but if they are still under Mike Ashley's command in a couple of months' time, have a go at Salomon Rondon, who is available for a good fee, who's been
presumably would fit more the bill than Perez would,
definitely.
Right? In terms of current
like,
style.
A proper target man. I don't see there aren't that many straight lines between him and Abraham. There is a similarity which would allow him to fit into what Villa do, and I think I don't see a better target man performance than all season from a club of that standing than Rondon's at Stamford Bridge.
Did you see Venezuela beating Argentina 3-1?
I did not,
because Rondon was just immense.
Rondon's a man.
Really,
Rondon is
really
an
good.
alpha male of a player who works far harder than he's given credit for, and in a team that's sort of like Joe's giggling in the background. That's the level of professionalism.
I'm giggling because your significant other is sat on the other side of the room, and she made a face when you said that.
She's committed now. We're getting married. There's nothing she can do about it.
But you were talking about an alpha male man.
An alpha male man. But he's just like, he has, if you think of the stereotypes associated with target man play, you picture Salomon Rondon. Like he can receive the ball with, you know, 3 centre halves around him, and because of his size and technique and the way he plays the game, he is that staging point.
It's in the pheromones, isn't it?
And that sort of player that sort of player is not dying out by any stretch of the imagination. If you look at, for example, the Italian under-21 side, they've got a couple of players who are very much in that mould, like Pinamonti is the enter striker. So there's still room for like big bustling forwards, but in the Premier League particularly, there's been a move more towards the sort of player who can drop off, the sort of player who can link up, false nines, if you will.
Harry Kane does it all, of course.
Harry Kane does it all, sure, when he's not hobbling around. But I think if you're someone like Villa, and again, this is a coaching question, but you're going to have to integrate a large number of new players. So that's a non-negotiable. That is just going to happen. In which case, what do you want to concentrate on from a coaching perspective? Well, it's easier to coach defense in some ways than it is to coach attack, particularly if you're not the sort of pressing side that, say, for example, a Liverpool are. But at the same time, that to me, that's the bit that you want to get absolutely right before you start working on anything complicated and new. So if you're Dean Smith and you've already got a host of kind of, you know how to, and your coaching staff knows how to implement the same system, then you want to try and keep that system relatively similar and find players that will fit what some of your guys are used to, because McGinn will stay, Grealish will stay, Hurahan will stay. You know, a lot of the guys who were integral to how that system worked will be around
in the later months. Yeah.
So you know they're already there. So you want to fit you want a round peg for a round hole rather than trying to get. And this is why, for example, I wouldn't go for Perez, because I don't think Perez works for that style.
I think what's interesting,
although he's a good player.
What's interesting about what you're saying as well is that you want round pegs for round holes. The frightening thing I would say about the situation that Villa are in is that many of the holes that now need filling are squad holes. They're not necessarily first 11. You know, we picked 3 players there who probably aren't returning and might need to be replaced. But many of the list of players who are leaving are sort of older players who, towards the end of this season at least, or perhaps even earlier than that, weren't featuring in the squad. Does it present a slightly different and difficult challenge to bring in players who know they aren't necessarily going to feature every week? If you're bringing in 5 players to fill out the squad, because it's thin at the moment.
I'm not sure they even are filling out the squad. I mean, I think if you look at the side that started most of the games towards the end of the season of Premier League level, really, you've got Grealish left. McGinn. McGinn could be good, definitely. But
Seb likes McGinn.
If you can look beyond his running style, he runs funny.
What kind of male is he?
He's kind of alpha.
Okay.
I don't think he's an alpha. I think he's a beta. Anyway, by the by, the rest of that squad is either good but old, not there anymore, or actually not that good. Weirdly, I think actually Lovre Kalinic, who was the goalkeeper they brought in January, probably is Premier League standard, so I wouldn't bother buying another goalkeeper.
Looks like he might be leaving though.
What, already? Mm-hmm. After 6 months?
I think he had an injury which led to Jed Steer coming in, and I think he's unsettled. The talk is that he looks like he might be on his way out.
I think Jed Steer's played very well.
Jed Steer was recalled from loan to play.
I understand,
as the first
but
keeper.
then football history, you have players that happens to players sometimes. I mean, I think he's. I don't know whether he's a Premier League goalkeeper, but I wouldn't dismiss him out of hand. That's all.
My point being that in terms of your question, are you looking to recruit players who are coming in and happy to be squad players? That isn't the issue for them. I think it'll be really interesting to see what's going to happen from a recruitment perspective, because obviously you have a look at Fulham last season, who recruited players who are actually very good and will go on and do well. And we talked before the podcast, Seb and I, about the 2015-16 season when Villa last went down. And there they recruited a bunch of players from Ligue 1, some of whom are excellent players. So you Idrissa Gueye, Jordan Veretout, Jordan Amavi, who should have been much better than he was. Adama Traore, not from Ligue 1, but a good player and an interesting impact player. There was clearly, under Ian Atkins, who was the previous head of scouting there was a clear theory about the sort of player that you should try and get. They were all reasonably priced. I'd say some of them were excellent value. And for some reason, it didn't work. And it's sort of a bit like Fulham this season, although I would argue that the reason it didn't work at Fulham is because they didn't get a decent defender. But it will be really, really interesting to see whether Villa kind of look at this, how they used to do stuff, which was pretty savvy but didn't necessarily work, or whether they are super cautious, whether they think, okay, well, we've got James Bree coming back. He was kind of a prospect when he was at Barnsley, maybe didn't do so well at Ipswich, but let's give him a bit of a run. There's many different ways they could approach this. I still don't think it's going to be enough. I think Villa are. There's too much to do, in my opinion, for it to work.
Before we discuss ownership, sounds like we know where Alex is. Seb, what are your expectations for Villa?
Well, I don't think we should undersell the proposition that they are offering. Like, Villa coming up they're not your average newly promoted team. And also, we talked about sort of that, the good parts of their recruitment before they went down. And they were able to recruit those players despite the fact that really they were selling a ticket on the Titanic. So I'm interested to see they're not going to be offering huge wages. They're not going to be able to shop at great expense.
But they theoretically are the third wealthiest club in England.
Well, there you go. So that you're able to offer sort of a player, the chance to get on board at the start of what should be, like, hypothetically, the beginning of this new era. And I'm interested by that because that appeals to players. Also, Villa Park's a wonderful place to play football. So one of the best places to watch the game in the whole country. So, I know these are little things which probably matter more to fans and journalists than they do to players. They're still important. I think they'll struggle. Like, I think because of all the reasons we've discussed, I never like flux. It always unsettles me. I want to see a stable core in a team and, sign off it from there. But
are you like that in your life?
You can ask a higher authority than me. She's sitting behind me.
Yes.
So we got 2 thumbs up there. Yeah, okay. But it's going to be because they won't push all their chips into the table in the summer. It's going to be cautious. It's going to be if they're going to be successful, it's going to be because they've finished between 15th and 17th. They're not going to do a Wolves. Clearly not. Just because they're not at that stage of their regrowth yet.
Well, will you explain to me why they've got so much money?
So, obviously, I mean, that's a nice broad question.
I really love the way you put that. That just amused me.
Your face is sagged. You just, yeah, okay.
I was trying to save time, but we've wasted it now, haven't we?
Okay, we have. Yes, that's my fault. So obviously last summer, Tony Shearer we're still not quite sure how it got to the stage that it did under him.
I think there was some concerns about being able to move money from various countries to other various countries.
What we know about
international difficulties.
It's known as capital flight, basically, and China doesn't love it.
No, it doesn't.
I think that's the way to put that. But obviously, at this time last year, Villa had some very intimidating and fastly approaching tax deadlines that they would have been unable to meet had it not been for new investment. Fortunately enough, they were taken over. I can't remember the exact date of it. I want to say it was about July last year, July 2018. 55% of the club was sold to Tifo Studios and Wes Edens. And Tifo Studios is a member of the wealthiest family in Egypt. He's
very wealthy.
Very, very wealthy. And if that wasn't enough, Wes Edens...
who, incidentally, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Birmingham Live article, for some reason, kept calling him Wes Edens. I think it was...
What, like a hyphen?
Some kind of error. No, just Edens twice, but every time it was mentioned.
That's interesting.
It's a quirk.
Maybe one for another podcast about something else, but sure. That's interesting enough.
Do continue.
Wes Edens is an interesting guy. Like he, if you read up on him, a couple of years ago, the New York Times referred to him as the new king of subprime lending, which is a little bit disingenuous because he didn't actually make his money from the practice of subprime lending. He invested in the
whole dirty affair.
Yeah, but probably more relevant is was his ownership of the Milwaukee Bucks, who are a basketball team. So him and his business partner bought the franchise in 2014. And at one point, he, in a bid to leverage a new stadium from the city of Milwaukee, threatened to move the team.
I tried and tested practice.
Yeah, it's kind of very similar to the Stan Kroenke situation with St. Louis and Los Angeles. Although in this instance, Milwaukee came up with the X hundred number of $1 million.
They caved to the ransom.
Yeah, I don't know how relevant it is. So like when a foreign owner comes into the league, we're always looking for these red flags and always looking for the kind of the smoking Stan Kroenke gun.
Thing is, if they're American and they're in sport,
it's a different thing. Like it's a different culture, and
it's sort of expected.
And also that kind of effectively ransoming the location of a franchise against enforcing state investment in it is a very regular thing.
Exactly,
that often doesn't result in anything
exactly
happening.
That. So when
I also say before you carry on as well, I think the one we took, I think it's awful and wrong. But when we talk about it in the UK as it relates to football, I think we think about it in the frame of what if Aston Villa were to move?
This is the thing,
and it's not quite the same thing.
No,
there's a different set of rules, and that always has been.
It's not the same thing, and also it's not really contextually relevant because that dynamic just doesn't exist in football. Like there is one, two if you include Arsenal, one terrible franchising precedent, and everyone hates it forever. But Wes Edens, For now, all that really matters is he is an extraordinarily wealthy businessman. He's worth billions of dollars, and he is in Aston Villa's corner.
$2.5 billion.
Well, the thing is that I remember I read an article when this first happened. I think back in sort of September, October of last year, and it's really important not to prejudge people. Like if you were to say, like, you needn't be wary of a Wes Edens and a Tifo Studios when your previous owner has been Randy Lerner. I mean, it's sort of like a default position, isn't it? New owner, what's wrong with him? What does he actually want? Why? What is the real reason behind him owning this football club? And in reality, almost every owner has an ulterior motive now. But that's kind of okay because we have enough examples where the club's interests can exist independently or exist sort of have a sort of codependency with a kind of whatever soft power objectives exist or whatever marketing objectives. It's just the way the game is. So we needn't kind of point fingers all the time. So until either of these people sort of show or give us reason to think otherwise, it's not a benevolent gesture. Of course, no one's being that naive, but there isn't kind of the need to sort of point accusatory fingers or try and find some kind of underlying conspiracy which may exist somewhere.
Also, the best owners in the Premier League currently are American.
There you go.
So,
who are they?
Oh, FSG, Liverpool's in terms of taking an astute long-term approach to planning, strategy, growing a football club at a sensible rate, believing in a particular manager, reinforcing that with a series of transfers to assist a system of play. No one's doing it better.
No one would say also that FSG aren't using, in sort of inverted commas, Liverpool for their own purposes. There is always a secondary purpose here. And so, there's nothing, Villa's owners, since they came in, they've implemented all the things that Villa did not have prior to them arriving. Like if you think back to sort of what the club was under Lerner and Dr. Shear, as an organisation, very underdeveloped in terms of who was in what positions, who was making decisions, and how qualified those people were to be making those decisions. And so, sort of the trajectory that is being created by their arrival, well, that's not due anything but praise at the moment. Doesn't mean that you can't remain skeptical in the future, but at the moment, it's a success story.
I read it was in Birmingham Live again. Birmingham Live.
You should read other newspapers, other Midlands.
I'm a big fan of Birmingham Live, but I read in Birmingham Live earlier that according to, I didn't read this bit, I wrote this bit, according to Birmingham Live, a promotion bonus agreement made by Tony Shear with Randy Lerner when he bought the club in 2016 has left the new owners with £30 million to pay out as a result of the promotion. I think the agreement reportedly would have ended this year, so had they not been promoted, they wouldn't have had to pay it. But that's what Birmingham Live says.
It feels symptomatic of what the club was, sort of, leveraging their future against things that didn't really make sense. I mean, it's kind of, I have a great deal of sympathy for Villa fans for what they've had to put up with over the last decade. I mean, I think that was reflected in the sort of, I mean, it seems a long time ago now, but in the kind of the average attendance you used to see at Villa Park on Premier League match days. You'd have clubs that would ordinarily attract, sort of people that were becoming disenfranchised. And even for sort of the big clubs, the Manchester United, the Chelseas, the Spurs, that kind of size of side, you just saw so many empty seats, and that's the saddest sight in football. And that was a direct reaction to kind of the sort of the ennui that crept into Lerner's reign over many, many years. And yeah, it's actually nice because so often this situation, I mean, at the time that we're recording this, Newcastle takeover isn't completed. But it's a very similar situation to the Northeast. I mean, it hasn't manifested in the same way. There's still a lot of people at St James's Park, but it's kind of this
huge ancient structure.
Well, yeah, but it's like a pervasive hopelessness which seeps into the support, which from what I noticed from the outside seemed to characterise what Villa were when they left the division.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming, Seb.
Thank you, Joe.
Alex.
Thanks.
I hope people have enjoyed that. And we'll be back next week with I don't know what, but listen to that one. Thank you.